I'm showing the time now is 3:30. We're going to call the January 5th meeting of the Ordinance Advisory Board into session. Looks like everyone is present with the exception of Amy Hallman and Thomas Finley. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the December 15, 2022 special meeting. Does anyone have any questions about those? No? Okay. I'll open the floor up for a motion to approve those minutes.
Motion to approve.
We have a motion to approve. Is there a second? All in favor? Motion passes. Yes, Tim Taylor abstained because he was not in attendance at the meeting. Moving on to item 3, public comments. We have one person signed up to speak. Commissioner Boone, did you want to hold your comments until the relevant section of the agenda, or did you just? Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan Boone, 317 Southland Road, Huntersville, North Carolina. I wish Coach was here, but since he's not, I will continue. I would just like to say thank you to 3 people up here, Brandy, Tim, and Thomas. Thank you for your service to this board. 2 of you have, in the maximum time, your parole is, you've done your justice to the citizens, and you're going to be released. And Brandy, I hope you will throw your name in the hat for an additional 3 years, but I just want to say thank you for all your hard work and the dedication to the town.
Thank you, Commissioner Boone. Next item on the agenda is item 4A, considering a recommendation on the proposed amendment TA 22-12. I'll turn the floor over to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a presentation to make, but this will be the 4th time we've heard this thing. So I'm going to short circuit my presentation. As many of you know, Frank has also some additional language. That's what was just passed out as a possible alternative. So I have that motion that he has in a slide. So basically, what you see on the screen is the text amendment that we are proposing. You know it's residential up to 50% of the first floor area or commercial use only, and we're also making some slight adjustments to the definition of commercial use and further defining non-residential use. And so that's the text amendment that we have talked about on several occasions. Frank has a motion, and I'm not going to go over there what's on the left-hand side, but in essence, his suggestion was, instead of the language that we had, it's 100% commercial first floor, however, up to 40% residential and or non-residential floor area space may be allowed. Any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning. So I don't mean to short circuit everything, but I did want to just get it out there. I've got lots of backup slides. If we want examples, building examples, we've got that as well. And so staff sticks with our recommendation for all the reasons we've told you previously. And with that, Mr. Chairman, we are happy to answer any questions, and I'm sure Frank can answer any questions he has as well.
Any questions from the board? Mr. Gammon. Can you go back? Hang on. 1 second. Mr. Gammon.
All right. Number one, I've talked to a number of people. If I didn't talk to you, it's because I didn't have your phone number. And maybe I need to get your phone numbers for we would share some phone numbers so we can cross-talk on some of this in the future. But I've made some changes to this based on talking to commissioners, based on talking to other members here. This is an attempt to, let's get a motion, instead of this going into another month, let's get a motion on the table, let's discuss it. If there are amendments proposed, we can do that. normal procedures. But made one change to this motion over there. I did add several new policies from 2040 that aren't on this slide. So you'll hear those numbers that I felt were appropriate. And I'll read this for the record. Right? Go ahead. All right. The Huntersville Ordinance Advisory Board recommends that text amendment 22-12 move forward to public hearing. Planning Board recommendation and Town Board decisions as written with the following change. Delete first floor diagram wording in Section 2 and Section 3 and replace with 100% commercial use of first floor area. However, up to 40% residential and/or non-residential floor space may be allowed. Any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning. The HOB feels that the rewording of the proposed amendment provides multiple zoning district adaptability, allowing mixed-use buildings to be configured for success based upon their specific site locations. The recommendation is based on the amendment being consistent with LU6, LU7, LU10, EV1, EV2, D-1 and D-10 of the Huntersville 2040 Community Plan. It is reasonable in the public interest to amend the zoning ordinance because the amendment clarifies first floor residential and commercial area requirements.
Okay, so that is what you're proposing as a
That's my motion,
motion. So you're,
if I get a second.
okay.
Before we get into the second, I just want to make a point, a clarifying point. The language that you've proposed is contradictory because of the fact that commercial use is non-residential use. So when you say 100% commercial use or up to 40% residential and/or non-residential, that doesn't really make sense because you're saying that you can have 100% commercial or only 40% non-residential, and commercial is non-residential.
All right, Mike.
I wanted to put that
All right,
out there.
well, I can amend this. I'll ask the question, is there a second? Because if there's not a second, there's no sense to answer the question.
Okay, we have a second. I'd like to open it up for discussion then.
I made the motion, I'll make the initial comments, may I do that?
What's that?
May I make the initial comments since I made the motion to?
Yes, go ahead and make those comments, and then,
All right.
Mr. Klutz, you're up next.
Based upon a conversation with HOA member Amy Hallman, I requested the Planning Department consider the following. Is there a need for different floor space requirements within the town center district? That's for the Planning Department's consideration. Addressing concerns from town commissioners at Monday's public hearing. Also, if I missed a concern regarding this text amendment and do not address it here, I apologize to that commissioner for that. First, Commissioner Boone's comment, I would request that the Planning Department consider addressing the need to orient first floor mixed-use commercial use space on primary streets. That said, I did not add that to the motion because while I consider it valid, I believe it needs to be reviewed by the Planning Department to determine the best application across multiple zoning districts and varied street styles. Besides, the Planning Board needs something to do. We haven't met in 2 months. Second, as mentioned by Commissioner Phillips, I would also encourage but not regulate residential spaces on first floor for the disabled and elderly, since the vast majority of these type of buildings do not have elevators, if any. And yes, while there are multiple age-restricted housing locations with accommodations in Huntersville, there may be a need for a disabled or elderly citizen to reside near a place of care, employment, or family where single or multi-storied housing with accommodations does not exist. And lastly, Mr. Semino's comments that requiring an applicant to return to town board would add a month to the approval process. This is valid, but it's currently taking 4+ months for approval. And I provide Birkdale Village in North State as examples. And then we'll come back to the non-residential piece in a moment. Well, that's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Klutz, you had a...
It's been addressed. That was going to be my question, Mr. I like the language in the motion. I read it earlier, but I was just a little confused on the however portion, because I wanted, my question is, are non-residential and commercial not the same? So I think you're going to.
Well, and I'm open to changing things if the lawyer and the rest of you feel it needs to be changed. The reason I wrote it that way is because I did not say 100% commercial, the first floor area. I said 100% commercial use, and that is defined in our zoning ordinance. There is other commercial that is not defined in our commercial use for this town, and that is non-residential, and that's why I added that.
There are uses, though, that are not commercial and not residential. So I understand where staff is coming from on this, but there are certain uses that are neither. Non-residential incorporates everything, commercial plus the non-residential aspects, but aspects of non-residential are not necessarily commercial.
Is that a question or just a statement?
I mean, that's my understanding. But
Right, there are
when you go
some-
to the definition
There
of,
are some uses that are not under commercial use or residential use, such as a school.
yeah, so if we don't have that in there, those non-residential uses would not be allowed in that first floor.
Can we wait till the attorney's paying attention, because she's going over all this again, so.
I'm good with that.
I understand, when we get to talking about this, we'll be right back where we were.
Okay,
I'll answer that question as soon as. So here's, staff was initially comfortable with using the term, like we had today, non-residential use on that first floor. When the town board asked the staff to look at this, and through several meetings with the Ordinances Advisory Board, there seemed to be a wish to have more commercial uses, activity in that first floor, and more retail, resident. And really, because we define commercial use for many things, we said, well, yeah, that makes sense. So let's just say commercial use. That's why we wrote, the way we had proposed the text amendment, which is residential up to 50% of the first floor area, and or commercial use only. So that's why we did what we did. There are some uses that are not commercial, such as the school, but it was our sense that's not really what the board was looking for in those areas. But you can write it however you want to do it. But that's why we went with the commercial use instead of the non-residential.
any additional discussion?
I just want to make sure I understand this. Did you say that there was, in our regulations, our ordinances, there is a difference between commercial use and other things that are not commercial that are, I mean. Go back to the
I don't, there is no definition of commercial in our zoning ordinance. The definition is commercial use. So that is why they changed it during our discussion a month ago. The planning department changed where they wrote commercial to commercial use. So that's the reason.
It has been changed, okay.
And non-residential, if you can go back to that slide, you see at the bottom there, non-residential, all uses that are not residential use, but it also includes commercial use. So there are theoretically some things that are not commercial and not residential that are just non-residential.
I agree with that. I'm not sure the attorney still agrees with that.
Then I would go back because the attorney asked a question, and I said I would ask it if she heard my earlier reasoning for including non-residential. And if she has a point to make there, I'm fully listen to her.
My point was that all non-residential includes commercial, but not, I'm sorry. So commercial is included in non-residential. You understand that, right? But not all non-residential is considered commercial per our ordinance definition. So here, Frank's proposed language says the bottom floor can either be 100% commercial use as defined in our ordinance, and then there's a, however, it could be up to 40% residential and or non-residential. So you're conflicting because that 100% commercial is considered non-residential. So you've then got it limited to 40% non-residential. So the wording conflicts internally. And that, as Chairman Jones has pointed out, is what we are trying to avoid.
All right, so, and I'm willing to change that, but I would ask the question, is there commercial use? There is, when I say non-residential, is there commercial use that could be put on that first floor that's not included, excuse me, I'm going to rephrase it. Is there commercial space that could be put on that first floor that's non-residential that's not listed in our commercial use?
So there are things that are non-residential, but not commercial, that would go there. But what I'm saying is that when you say 100% commercial use, which is considered a non-residential use, but then say, or only up to 40% non-residential, that doesn't make sense.
Frank, what if we changed it to residential or non-commercial use? Would that cover it?
Well, that doesn't include non-residential. That's the discussion right now, that does not include non-residential uses.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I wasn't clear, I'll try to rephrase that. So,
And I could be wrong, but as Jack had pointed out, I believe the reasoning behind changing staff's proposed language to say commercial use was because they felt that this board and the town board wanted the lower level to specifically be commercial use and not other non-residential uses. So that's why I'm not sure that this proposed language would be carrying out the intent of what they wanted to see when they suggested staff come up with a text amendment. One other thing while I'm up here is that I also would not suggest putting directly in a specific section of the ordinance that if you don't meet this requirement, that you can seek a conditional rezoning, because that's always an option. If a developer wants to seek a modification of the ordinance, they can always undergo a conditional rezoning, but we don't in every single subsection of the ordinance call out that you have to seek a conditional rezoning if you don't want to meet this requirement. So I wouldn't suggest doing it in this instance either.
okay. I'm willing to make an amendment at this point that removes the non-residential for this discussion to move this amendment forward, and so we can have further discussions on it, and if it turns out to be valid, then it can be added at a later time at the planning board. So I would change, I make an amendment. Kathy, this is the amendment, so you have to approve it also. I'm going to rephrase it to say 100% commercial use of first floor area, however, up to 40% residential floor space may be allowed. Any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning. So in effect, I've taken out the and/or non-residential piece of that statement. Do you approve that? I approve it.
I just had a question about the non-residential versus commercial. So when you say there's things that are not commercial, that are non-residential, and you mentioned schools, so would a daycare facility or a church or something like that be considered non-residential or commercial?
Right, so we go back to our definition of commercial, and it does say that daycare is allowed. So you just go back to the what are the things that are in the commercial definition?
Say a church, would that be allowed?
Yes, a church would be allowed. That's a good example of non-residential.
Right, because they might need a small space, and I mean, I personally don't see where that would be a deterrent, that would be a good thing. Just, I just wanted to clarify that. And I agree with your amendment, Frank.
Hold on, I don't see churches in this list. Am I missing something?
Non-residential, that's commercial use.
So,
And to further answer the next piece of that question that I was asked by the lawyer, I prefer to keep the any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning. I want it plain out, flat, known, that's what's going to have to happen.
So just so I can follow up on Emily's comment, because that is not listed everywhere else in the zoning ordinance, it raises the question. So that's why Emily and I would recommend not having it in there, because it's always an option available. And since it is not listed in other places, it's an option available, if you list it here, then it begins to question, well, why aren't you listing it elsewhere? Is that not an option? So that's the purpose of leaving that out, Frank. And so that's why if you're going to do this, we would recommend leaving it out. But
I don't have an issue with it. Made the motion, take it out, and we move on my side, anyway.
So right now, the way the ordinance is written, first floor area can be non-residential only. So,
strike through. I'm just trying to make sure I get is that the way you would take that sentence out?
What I'm taking out of that statement is the word and/or non-residential.
Got you. Okay, I'm with you now. Thank you.
That was the amendment.
okay. So right now,
And it would be struck out on the motion also. I'm sorry, Matt.
no problem, no problem. Okay, so right now, our ordinance allows 100% of the first floor to be non-residential. I understand that the town board wants to focus on commercial, I get that. So the way you had originally written this, up to 100% is the interpretation of commercial on the first floor, but then you can have the ability to have 40% either residential or non-residential uses. Yes, commercial is a part of non-residential, but there are uses that are non-residential that are not considered commercial. So we're making it more restrictive on the first floor, not allowing non-residential uses if we remove that. Does everybody follow what I just said?
That's where I had a concern, because you said daycares are covered under commercial. But say if there was a small startup church that wanted to have a space on the first floor in a mixed-use building, they're not going to be able to do that because they're non-residential, they're not commercial.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's just me personally. I would like for them to have the same opportunities.
So again, as we originally proposed it, we stuck with the term non-residential. But we heard some concerns from the town board and from this committee that, well, that's not really what we're looking for. So that's fine. We are comfortable leaving it for commercial use because it's defined, and leave it as it is. But if you want to do something different, that's fine.
I'm just, you guys know how I am about regulation, and, things need to be flexible and adaptive. And, I get the commercial use, I get where we're going with that. But that 40%, either non-residential or residential, does provide some flexibility.
All right. Are you asking me to withdraw the amendment?
I think how you wrote it is flexible and does not restrict that non-residential uses in the first floor of the building.
Right. Are you asking me to
This
withdraw?
requires effectively a minimum of 60% commercial in the bottom floor, the way you've written this. So
So you're asking me to withdraw the amendment?
that's just my comment. That's my comment, Frank. I'm not asking you to withdraw
Ask
it.
me.
Well, I would ask you to withdraw that amendment,
I withdraw my amendment.
and then we also need to add in the interpretation piece into your motion as well, that we haven't discussed yet.
You second the withdrawal.
Okay. So we have a motion on the floor that has been seconded for 100% commercial use in the first floor area. However, up to 40% residential and/or non-residential floor space may be allowed. Any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning, which is effectively your original motion. Okay. I do think we need to talk about the interpretation piece being bundled in with this to create a more comprehensive solution. And this motion does not address that, or we can try to address that as a second part of this agenda item.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Matt. I'm sorry.
Is my mic not working?
Sound system.
Yeah, I think it's better without sound. And I have old ears, Matt.
Might be better without the sound system.
Okay. Can you hear me now? How about I'll talk in your direction? Can you, everybody over here hear me? Okay, I'm going to talk in your direction so you can hear me better. Okay, so the motion on the floor is as you have originally written it. The only comment I would have is this does not address the interpretation piece that we've been talking about or trying to talk about. And I would like to see if we could add that in to this particular text amendment to provide a more comprehensive solution, such that, you know, the interpretation of town board conditions and the ordinance are consistent over time.
I support the things that you have written. As I mentioned at our last meeting, I really don't support adding it to this text amendment. I would prefer to see it as a separate text amendment. And I support you putting that out on the floor for discussion and for eventual vote.
Well, would you consider amending your motion to adding that the Ordinance Advisory Board will sponsor that as a separate text amendment?
So just for information purposes, the intent of the Ordinances Advisory Board was to have both discussions on this item, okay? That was the intent. So in your agenda packet, you did receive the recommendations that Matt had on how to change that rules, how to change the rules of construction. You also had some notes from town staff, town attorney on, you know, issues concerning that change. So in the agenda, we did intend to talk about both items, and we will talk about both items.
And I'm more than willing to do that. How do I break this out as a separate entity so that we can vote on this and move this on and then have the discussion for the second piece?
So if you make a motion just on this, we are going to go right into the rules of construction because that's part of this agenda. So
So this is part one, effectively?
that is correct.
Okay, all right. So just so we're clarifying, this is part one of the proposed text amendment, and then we will jump into the interpretation piece and decide whether we want to incorporate that or not into this particular text amendment. So, motion on the floor is the original motion that Mr. Gammon made. Are we ready to vote on that?
This is for the original
His original motion as written is the motion on the floor with a second. Are we ready to vote on that? Does anybody have any additional questions or discussions? And then we'll move on to the second part of this.
I got one question.
Yes, sir.
Staff's fine with this. I mean,
No, we don't recommend this.
I've been a little confused as to, like, I think you and Frank both mentioned, we've been talking about this for 3 or 4 months now. So is staff opposed to an increase in commercial use of first floor units, or staff just doesn't like it being mandated by this text amendment?
I guess I would say it's two levels of why we don't suggest this. One, we do recommend sticking with, you know, the minimum of 50% commercial. Now, under this proposal, it's 60% commercial. So there's a 10% increase. So that's a minor increase, but that's one thing. That's one, yes, it's close, right? It's not 75, it's not 100, but it's close. So but we still recommend 50%. For the reasons being that the easier you make it for folks to develop here in Huntersville, the more attractive it is. We've provided you copies of what other communities do. Other communities don't go into that direction. Yes, Cornelius does require 100%, but I could go to Davidson, I could go to Matthew, I can go to other places, and I don't have that. So I see it as a disincentive. We see it as a disincentive. The other thing that I would I'm not comfortable that we say the rule is 100%, but you could do 40% of this. That's just, that to me, you're adding words to it, right? So it's 100% on the first floor, but you could do 40% of residential, non-residential. So, I mean, it could be reworded in wordsmith. Frankly, the only difference I see between what Frank had proposed and what we had proposed is that 10% differential. That's the way I'm seeing it. I would just word things differently. But that's the big difference, is the 10% differential.
Because the exception of allowing however up to 40% in it, which I know there's a 10% variance in the two opinions, is basically almost 50-50. I mean, we're 60-40. We're at 60-40 the way this is written, is that correct?
Yeah, it'd be 60-40, that's correct, yeah, 60-40. And the other
In
thing.
the
that-
event they choose to do that ratio, but they could go 100% commercial, or they could go 40% residential,
So I
non-residential.
would not word it this way, so that's,
Well,
it can be a lot cleaner.
I will tell you, and it may be, I will tell you one of the reasons, I had a recommendation on the wording for this reason. So the reason I went this route, and I agree with it, is that what happens when you build, you're not building in town center and you're building at a node that won't support that amount of commercial. This text amendment allows the applicant to come back to the town board and say, I want to do 40% commercial and 60% residential, non-residential. The other way does not allow that.
Now you've got me confused, and I'm going to have to enforce it, so that's got me really concerned now. The way this is worded, everybody has the right, no matter where it's located, to go 40% residential or non-residential, whether it's downtown or whether it's in a node somewhere. Only when you go over that 40% is someone have to go use the vehicle of a conditional rezoning. Is that what you just said?
Any additional residential or non-residential floor space shall require conditional rezoning. So if they wanted 60% residential, non-residential floor space, they'd have to do conditional
Yes,
rezoning.
that is.
Whether it's 50% or 60%. I mean, I felt like the flexibility needs to be there for any building, regardless of where it's located. That's why the question was asked, does there need to be a different wording for town center?
I have a question, actually. So the way this is written, you're saying that they could do 40% non-residential. So that would leave 60% that would have to be residential. But you're saying it can only be 40% residential. So you're never going to get to 100%.
It says and/or. It doesn't say, it's not separate. You can't have 40% residential and 40%, unless you go back and you ask for more space.
So that's why, again, I'm pointing out that the numbers don't add up.
Well, when the numbers change, the other numbers change, so they'll always add. I mean, that's my interpretation. So if you have 40%, let's say you start with 100% commercial use of the first floor, that's 100%. You come back and say, okay, I want 40% residential, so then it drops to 60%. But another applicant in a different building says, I want 60% residential. The 100% of commercial use drops to 40%. But all of that has to go back to the town board for conditional rezoning and to meet their intent of what they want.
Can we, one second.
The one thing I'm going to throw in before there is please turn on your microphones and speak into them. We can't hear you online.
Got it. Ms. Jones, you had a question.
Okay, I think I know what Emily is trying to get us to understand is, okay, the goal was 100% commercial on first floor, but in the same breath, it says you can have up to 40% residential, but if you want more than 40% residential, you can do the conditional rezoning. So you could, in effect, get more than 40% residential, right? And see, that's where we saw another issue with the North State is they were below what was required because they went through and got, the conditional piece of it. So they ended up even having to have less than what we normally require. So would this create that same situation?
I'll answer it, yeah, sure. Even if this language is not in there, which we recommend it not be in there about conditional zoning, because it's always an option. So it's always an option.
So if we have 100% commercial use on first floor, but you can go to conditional rezoning to get up to 40% residential, would that be different? Would that guarantee you to get your?
My concern is the way the conditional zoning is written. It says when someone goes through conditional rezoning, the town board may modify standards as long as they meet the spirit of the ordinance. So I think even if this said 40% conditional, I mean, there's still enough language in there that somebody could say, well, let's do 31% or something. So That's a concern I would have.
I think I have a resolution here. A modification to this that solves this problem. So Frank, in your language, what I think we need to do, where it says in the first line, up to 40% residential and non-residential space may be allowed, that is the first sentence of that paragraph.
That's the first what?
That's the first sentence of the paragraph. Up to 40% residential and/or non-residential floor space.
Period, right.
That is the first sentence. And then, or commercial use only.
That wording works for us.
It's similar to what you have.
Similar to what's there. It makes more sense to us, even though we still think it ought to be 50-50, but that wording
Does everybody understand?
addresses the.
All right, read that. I may agree with this. Read that again.
So-
What have you changed? You took 100% commercial use of first floor area out?
No, that is still
Okay.
in. We're just changing the where these words are, the order.
Go ahead.
So the first, we're taking, in the first sentence, up to 40% residential and non-residential floor space may be allowed. That becomes the first part of the paragraph in the sentence, okay?
Okay?
And then at the end of that, we're striking 100% commercial use, and we're saying after allowed or commercial use only, to mimic what is already in the ordinance in that little illustrated box there. So if you look at how that is presented in
Okay.
the box, I'm just basically realigning the wording so it says right out of the, you understand when you read this that you can have up to 40% residential and/or non-residential floor space, or you can have 100% commercial.
All right, so you want me, make sure I'm clear. You want me to make an amendment to remove 100% commercial use of the first floor area, however, from this, and begin the sentence at the word up,
Up to 40%.
and then after allow, put a comma, and put or 100% commercial,
Or I would just say commercial use only, which is effectively 100%.
or commercial use only.
Does it-
Do not have a problem with that, so go ahead, Brandy.
I still don't think that addresses what Emily brought up, that because commercial use is included in non-residential use, if you're restricted to 40% residential / non-residential use, it still includes that. Commercial use is coming in on both sides, in my opinion, of those percentages.
Yes, you can have 100% commercial, but
But if
there,
you're, so this 40% is restrictive, 40% residential and/or non-residential?
It's
Because commercial use is within the definition of non-residential, I read that to say 40, you're capped at 40%
May I-
commercial
may I-
use, and it
may I-
contradicts.
Answer that. It's because I'm using commercial use from our definition that defines specific uses versus the word commercial.
But I think my problem is that commercial use is not carved out of non-residential use, so I think it's being pulled in both sides of, do you understand my concern?
there are uses that are not commercial and not residential that are in that non-residential piece.
But commercial is still in it.
Yes, commercial is still in it, but you can have 100% commercial if we say or commercial only. That encompasses,
I agree with like the intent, I just think that a cap on non-residential use, in my mind, includes commercial use, is why I see it as contradictory. But I'll defer to Emily on that.
that implies why we need a definition of non-residential in the ordinance, so it's clear what is what. And right now, it's not residential, it's not commercial. We've defined those two pieces. But what is non-residential? We know it includes commercial, and we know it includes non-residential uses, but anyway, that's my thoughts on that. If we just kind of realign the wording, Ms. Kelly, I understand where you're coming from there. I feel like non-residential uses needs to be in there because there are some uses that are not commercial and not residential that may need to be in that first floor. And this would give that flexibility to allow that being there. And if someone doesn't want to go 100% commercial, they can do that. But if they want to carve out 40% into residential, non-residential, they can do that as well. And so,
Could you word it 40% residential and/or non-residential, not covering commercial uses? In other words, you start to, the residential, you're then saying that not anything that's already covered under commercial use.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
we
not in
could,
favor, I'm just trying to move the,
yeah. We're 4 meetings in on this one. So, I mean, that's another way we would potentially look at it.
So when you look at what the old language was, and you listen to the conversation we're having, so could it not say residential or non-residential up to 40% of the first floor area?
Yeah, I mean, that's effectively what, or commercial use.
Or commercial use?
Yeah, I mean,
And that's,
that's effectively what we were saying.
So we're gonna go back to the original definition and just change the 50% to 40%.
In effect, that's what we could do.
And that's what that's what I think we should do. Yeah.
Frank, are you okay with that without the language with not, conditional rezoning being in there?
but then that gets you to the language in Mr. Gammon's amendment. It gets us to the same end game with only changing 50% to 40% and saying residential or non-residential. It is the same, it's the same end game, or I'm confused if it's not.
Now,
I
so
think it
what
is.
I'm hearing is you're asking an amendment. I would prefer to use commercial use first, but so let me try it that way. You're asking for someone, if not me, to make an amendment to reword this to commercial use or residential up to 40% well, there's no reason for, all right, let me rephrase, because it says commercial use or residential and non-residential up to 40% of the first floor area.
so that still gets to that issue of there's that overlap of non-residential and commercial overlap.
But that word is already in the original.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
Took it out and changed it to commercial.
This is.
Okay,
staff's
got you. There's so many lines, I'm mixing it up myself. All right, no, I understand. So commercial, go back to that again. So commercial use or residential up to 40% of the first floor area. That's what you're asking to be printed there, correct? Is that what you said?
That avoids the non-residential confusion.
All right, fine. So it says, and the reason I threw this out here for all of this discussion, so we get to a resolution, so this is fine. Commercial use, but I would prefer to have commercial use mentioned first because that's the most important thing that the town wants on that first floor. So commercial use or residential up to 40% of first floor area. Is that what you want? Is that it?
Do you have a percentage or an only in there?
I'm sorry, percentage what?
Are you including a percentage, or are you saying only about commercial use?
No, commercial, I didn't put 100% commercial use. If you like, I still say, does it need to say 100% commercial?
It does not. It
Does
just-
not. So I say commercial use or residential up to 40% of first floor area. Does that solve the problem? Is that acceptable? I don't,
We don't need to put anything about the 40% with conditional.
it's, if we don't put it there, it's still implied, because I'm going to make a statement about that in a second, once I know whether this is straight or not. Is that acceptable?
I'll live with it. Any other comments?
I'm willing to make the amendment. If you don't want to make the amendment, I'm willing to make the amendment. I just need to know if that's where we're heading.
I think that works unless everybody.
I'm going to say commercial use or residential up to 40% of first floor area.
I feel like that could be a little ambiguous. I would rather have the like up to in front of the
Okay?
resident.
Commercial use or up to 40% residential.
That works for me.
Commercial use or up to 40% residential of first floor area. You got that, Tracy? Okay. I'm going to say something. So is that good? Then I make that amendment. Do I agree with that amendment? And I make that amendment. Kathy, do you agree with it?
I'll second.
Okay, so now, but I've got to say something. We're still back at the same dilemma whether you put, because you can come back in there and they can put in a conditional rezoning and do exactly what we said before. They could make it 20% commercial, and it could be 80% residential.
There is a downside to doing that, though. They open themselves up to exactions. So the amendment that has been seconded on the floor to your original motion is commercial use or
up
up
to
to
40%
40% residential floor space
or up to 40% residential of first floor area.
of.
Does that make sense? Is that
Area.
good?
Does everybody understand the amended motion? Okay. Any discussion?
I'm curious how we think, like, what is the intention of not going with like kind of the original staff language and changing it to 60%? I'm curious to know what you think how it differs in the end.
You're asking Frank, right? Yeah.
No, so what's the question now? Why not say commercial
How
use?
that differs from the way it was originally.
Because if I say 40%, it still implies commercial use. It would say our commercial use only should be the last word, true. That implies 100%.
So it's that you want to take out like the non-residential piece?
I'm going to take it out at this point.
Okay, I just feel like we kind of arrive at the same thing as using the original language and just changing the percentage. So I was just curious, but either way is fine with me.
Any further discussion?
We could still end up with, say, 20% commercial if they go through a conditional rezoning.
That would be true, but that's always the case, that somebody can go through conditional rezoning, and it is a 4.5-month process. So they're adding 4.5 months to the process, and they are opening themselves up to all kinds of different things when you go through conditional rezoning.
I don't think they care.
It is expensive to rezone property. When you open yourself up to exactions, there are considerable costs associated with doing that. It's not just an ask and a zero-cost option. There is definitely a cost to asking for a rezone of any property type. Commissioner Munger.
Yeah, I just want to kind of follow up on Ms. Skelly's point that if you simply change what staff had recommended from a 50% to a 40%, is it residential up to, I'm sorry, up to the 40%, you will have delivered the intent of what you're really trying to do and made the modification of going from 50 to 60, which is what your goal is. And it's clear, and I believe, although they're not comfortable at 50%, if that is or at 40%, if that is your intent, you imply what you actually intended to do, and it makes it clear from a legal standpoint, would be my opinion. That's it.
Thank you, Commissioner Munger. Mr. Whitaker.
Well, now, the other question I've got is, do we need to address, before we vote on this, the issue of primary streets and the other issues that were discussed?
No, because we're not going to try to inject primary streets onto this where the commercial faces, so we won't have to correct. This will be much cleaner without having to go that route.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. We've had discussion. We can either consider an additional change to that motion.
No, I'm happy with the way it is. That's my motion. It accomplished what I set out to do. It doesn't matter what the wording is to me. It's finite.
Understand? Okay.
Can we read it one more time?
Yep. So the change that Mr. Gammon has proposed is the following: commercial use or up to 40% residential floor space in the first floor
First floor area is fine.
First floor area space. Does everybody understand the wording?
Commercial use or up to 40% residential of first floor area.
Then we don't need to say 100,
No,
we don't need to say 100% commercial. You-
no, I liked it before, but I don't care. It accomplishes the same thing. It's implied.
Okay.
To me it is. I'd ask the lawyer, but to me it's implied. It's 100% if it's not residential.
Is that right, Emily? It's implied 100%?
It's gonna be 100% on the floor, whatever it is, it's gonna be something. So it's either, it can't be more than 40% residential, so it's gonna be the other. So it's gotta be 100%, or it's gonna be vacant. If it's vacant, there's no problem.
Okay. All right, we have the motion on the floor. Is everybody ready to vote? Okay, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Frank, were you in favor?
No, yes.
Okay. All opposed? 2. Motion passes.
Part 2. Rules of construction. There's rules of construction, the subdivision ordinance in section 2.2, and rules of construction, the zoning ordinance 12.1. And this was the version that Matt had provided. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would just turn it over to you.
There was an additional version that I think I emailed out today that kind of cut and pasted aspects of the changes that I suggested. Yeah, right there. So there's some overlap between the subdivision ordinance. Anything in the yellow is new to that section. Anything that's kind of in teal is effectively being moved to do a different section. But the things being proposed here, I can kind of walk you through them and why I think it's a good idea that we're clear on these things so we have consistency in the way the ordinance is being interpreted, town board conditions of development are being interpreted, et cetera. It's critical that town staff consistently interprets our ordinance for applicants. So first thing, and this is mirrored in the zoning rules of construction and subdivision ordinance, any terms considered ambiguous should be construed in favor of the free use of real property. So that is from the visual properties case that we've talked about in prior meetings that Adam Lovelady at the Houston School of Government recommends. The case law says that's how you're supposed to interpret ambiguous terms. And that's why I think we need to have that in our ordinance so everyone on staff is clear that ambiguous terms in the ordinance are to be construed in favor of the free use of real property. Then next, interpretations of the ordinance should not render the ordinance language irrelevant or superfluous. That's another recommendation that the UNC School of Government uses in their rules of thumb. Part 8 there, the word should, that's just mirroring a provision that is in the zoning ordinance rules of construction. Part 9, and I think this is the most important piece, in the event of development conditions imposed by the Huntersville Town Board of Commissioners that are considered ambiguous, town staff will request guidance from the board to determine the board's intent. And that, I think, is probably the most important piece out of all of this because that's really why this amendment is here that we're talking about. And then 10, any conflicts will be interpreted so as to harmonize them rather than create an irreconcilable conflict. That's another one from the visual properties case and recommended by Adam Lovelady. In the event there's a conflict, it should be resolved in the order of the following priority with development conditions imposed by the town board taking precedent over basically every other condition in the ordinance. And then conflict and standards, that is a provision that is in the zoning ordinance section just being moved into this C, when there are two more sections of the ordinance that apply, the more specific section controls over the more general. That's based on case law, that's based on rules of thumb of interpretation guidance. And then D is basically copied out of the zoning ordinance and just put in this kind of stacking order. Similar in the, almost a mirror of that in the zoning ordinance rules of construction. I mean, one of the things we could do here is consider consolidating all of these and just having one section of rules of construction that covers both the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance. The other thing I will point to, do you have the rules of interpretation that Adam Lovelady wrote? Yes, that one. Okay, so this is, for those of you that don't know, I attended the Planning and Development Regulation class with the UNC School of Government that certifies zoning officials. And I attended that class in 2021. The only reason I'm not a certified zoning official is because I don't work for a town. So that's where this document is from. And there's a couple of things I wanted to point out to everybody here. And he cites 8 different bits of case law in these rules of thumb for interpreting the ordinance. The first one, stick with the text. When interpreting a local ordinance, determine to give effect to the intent of the governing board. Really, the last line here is, I think, of that particular paragraph is very important. Do not rely on the statements of individual board members or recollections of staff members. And that cites Fort versus County of Cumberland as case law. Unless the term is defined within the ordinance, uses plain meaning. That's citing case law. Avoid interpretations that create absurd or bizarre results. Another case cited there. Interpretations should not render the ordinance language irrelevant or superfluous. Another citing of case law. And then the last piece, any ordinance, under ordinance purpose and interpretation guidance. An ordinance may include purpose and intent language as well as rules of interpretation. Ours are rules of construction, which are basically the same thing, that help guide the interpretation. Such guidance will not trump the specific text of the ordinance, but may clarify and resolve ambiguity. So what we're trying to accomplish here is to create a framework or set of buffers that everyone can operate within to make sure things are being consistently interpreted. So that's all I really have to talk about that piece and the rationale for doing it. And there's case law to back up just about everything I've got in there. There may be differing interpretations of that, but I'm confident that the case law will back up what I've presented. So, are there any questions? Commissioner Munger.
Can I ask what the specific impetus behind bringing this before the HOAB was?
It was comments from the pre-meeting that I think that you made that you wouldn't have voted if you had known that there was a specific amount of square footage in the North State project. And ultimately, when you looked at the meeting minutes and the motion that was made, and how it was interpreted, and ultimately that interpretation process, that's what made me think we need to look at this very hard and make sure there's a consistent, clear process for interpretation so that conditions that your board imposes, the intent of those conditions are accurately put in place.
Okay. So there was no specific request to have this reviewed by the board or the planning staff or town attorney, is that my understanding?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
So what are we doing with this?
We are discussing whether we want to incorporate this into the text amendment that was as a result of this pre-meeting that we just mentioned about North State. And whether we want to bundle this with TA 22-12 to create more of a comprehensive solution. And the problem that I saw in this was it wasn't really our text and our ordinance, it was the process of interpretation of the conditions imposed by the town board of that rezoning.
So, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the issue was that the ordinance was not clear how you treat shared space. That was the problem with the North State. The town board consciously said you could do less than 50%, and they approved it at that. It's basically 34% non-residential use. But was not clear was that shared space, the storage, the mechanical equipment, whatever. So the ordinance that you just made a recommendation on says, clarified, that shared space is not going to count towards the commercial. It counts towards residential. Anything that's shared and has any component of residential goes to residential. So we're fixing that. This text amendment is fixing it. Now, I know the Ordinance Advisory Board recommended to go up from 50% to 60%. So that's one thing. Second thing, when the floor plan finally came to us months after the town board decision, I reached out to the person who made the motion. And the person who made the motion concurred with how we were interpreting it, and we processed it. I do believe the town board was considering, and I will rely on Commissioner Munger or Emily to weigh in, that when you have where that ambiguity is on a town motion, how does the staff handle it? I can tell you what I'm going to do next time. I'm going to talk to all of them, because I don't have to get slapped but once, and then I understand, right? But I would just defer to Emily. First off, I'd say what we did the first time, go to the person who made the motion. That's perfectly appropriate. Even the School of Government said it's appropriate, but that was not what met the expectation of our town board. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Yeah, and first I just want to say, Commissioner Jones, I appreciate your zealous interest in our ordinance. But if you all have not had the opportunity to read the almost 4 pages of notes that I made on this particular issue, I would highly encourage that you do so. There are many legal reasons for not codifying these pointers for interpreting ordinances and also case law into our ordinance. In fact, the takeaway that Professor Lovelady put in his presentation at the planning conference that you attended was not to go and change your rules of construction, but it was actually to go through the ordinance and look for areas of ambiguity and to fix those areas of ambiguity. I did a survey
And that's something
of-
we're trying to, in the process of doing
I
so.
did a survey of multiple other jurisdictions, and I could not find a single jurisdiction in North Carolina that has codified these rules of thumb or guiding principles for ordinance interpretation. And to Jack's point, certain motions that the town board makes create vested rights. So if you then later try to go back and ask for guidance on what the intent was behind that motion, it doesn't make a difference because a vested right was created and exists. So the best practice would be not going back after the fact and asking, what did you mean? It would be that making sure the motions are extremely clear the night that they are made, that the board members that are making a second and or voting in favor of the motion understand what it means, and also that staff, if the motion is stated, does not understand what the motion means, that they ask that night. So the board was actually given best practices in terms of motion making, and they opted not to create a policy. That was their decision. So I don't feel that a unilateral suggestion to put forth a text amendment that was not even suggested or proposed by this entire board, but a single member, is the route that we should be taking.
Well, ultimately, that's the decision of this board to make, whether we want to move forward with it or not. I will just note that, as Adam Lovelady said in this document we have in front of us, he recommends, and based on case law, not relying on statements from individual board members for interpretations. I would also say that not codifying this, well, let me ask you this question, Ms. Loop. Have you sent out a memo to make sure staff is complying with the visual properties case, the case law associated. Because if we exceed our authority based on statute or case law, we can be put in legal peril.
So in terms of me sending out a memo, no, I have not sent out a memo. However, I did write, again, 4 pages discussing that case in the notes for this particular meeting, which planning staff have access to.
Okay, but you have not ensured that planning staff understands that they are to interpret ambiguous terms in favor of the free use of real property and try to harmonize potential conflicts before creating irreconcilable conflicts per the visual properties case.
Again, I'll just reiterate my previous points. I encourage you all to read through the notes that I've provided, which have also been provided to planning staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Related to visual properties case, in your notes, you say that this is a judicial interpretation. I'm going to read you directly from that case law so we're clear as to what the court thinks, if I can get to it, as it relates to that aspect. Zoning ordinances, this is from the visual properties versus the Village of Clemens case. The zoning ordinances, can you go to, this would be page 29 of the packet. I think so. The original, the packet that was online.
Not the PowerPoint, no. I think Matt is talking about is the actual agenda packet. Is that correct?
Yes, in the agenda packet. So not as close, is what you're saying. Is that good? Okay, good. Okay, that works, great. Zoning ordinances are interpreted to ascertain and effectuate the intent of the legislative body. Rules applicable to the construction of statutes are equally applicable to the construction of municipal ordinances. But as discussed in more detail below, when there is ambiguity in a zoning regulation, there's a special rule of construction requiring the ambiguous language be construed in favor of the free use of real property. So wouldn't you say it's a good idea to inform staff that this is how the ordinance should be interpreted? Otherwise, we're going to get in trouble, or we should just codify it. And it would be simple because then everybody knows. Not only that, it's a good idea to codify things. We have to change the ordinance on a regular basis for case law, for legislative changes, for all sorts of things. Law and legislation is constantly fluid. So we're always having to change our ordinance as a result. Commissioner Munger.
Sure. I just like to draw attention to page 2 of our Code of Ethics. Section B, rather than to serve as an advocate for personal interests or interests of the public at large, it would be my feel at this point that you are serving your own personal public interest, and you have crossed several boundaries today. This is unacceptable behavior and should be noted for the record.
What boundaries did I cross, Commissioner Munger?
Rather than to serve as an advocate for personal interests or interests of the public at large. This
What personal interest am I
specifically-
serving?
Point of order, if you're going to ask me a question, I should be allowed to answer it.
Go right
And
ahead.
you have spoken over several people today.
Point taken.
When this HOAB board was founded specifically to handle issues that staff or attorney or the board is specifically asked to address, you've gone out of your way to find a personal agenda to push this forward. Staff and our attorney has specifically said, there is no point in doing this, and to me, it comes off as something self-serving, which is specifically against our code of ethics for this board.
This board has a duty to ensure compliance with authority, town authority, the legal aspects, statute, case law, constitutional limits, and this is in that realm. That's why I brought this up originally. We want to make sure our ordinance is compliant. What is my personal interest in doing this? I'm trying to protect the public from unnecessary litigation expenses. That's my personal interest in this. I don't want to pay more taxes and have my tax dollars be expended on unnecessary litigation when we can merely make some simple changes to our ordinance to make sure we are consistent in the way things are interpreted. I don't understand where you're coming from, Commissioner Munger.
We do disagree on this subject. For matters that in the legal realm, I refer to the one of two people in this room that actually have a JD following their name. That is there, and I should point out Brandy Skelly also has a JD, but I would defer to the people that actually have a legal background, and it is our attorney's job to look into these matters. If she felt it necessary for the Ordinance Advisory Board, she would have referred it to it. She would have reached out to the board to say, this may be something that we want to refer to it, and have the town board refer it over to you. It was not.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Gann.
I ask that we take a 5-minute recess, please.
Are we all in favor of taking a 5-minute recess? All in favor? We will recess and be back at 4:45. Thank you. Time is now 4:46, and we are bringing the meeting back from recess. I would like to just make a general statement that if, I want to apologize if I've talked over anybody here today, whether that be a fellow board member or staff. As everyone knows here, I'm pretty passionate about protecting the public interest and taxpayers of the town, and I spend a great deal of time on this, and if that's not coming off correctly, I apologize. I would like to say that also that I think it's in the best interest of this board and staff to work in a more collaborative fashion instead of one that maybe is adversarial. I think it's really in the public interest that we try to work together in a more collaborative fashion to do what is in the true best interest of the citizens of this town. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that. So we were discussing these changes to rules of construction. Does anyone have any questions or want to consider making a motion to either incorporate something like this or make a recommendation to incorporate something like this into Text Amendment 22-12, or table it or drop the matter? Mr. Gammon.
I want to make a motion to table this proposed, well, I don't know that I can call it a proposed text amendment now. Is it a text amendment?
The language that was provided by Matt was the language he proposed as a text amendment. to
Right.
the Rules of
But
construction.
I recommend that we table this discussion for further study, and at which time that you feel it needs to come back, then with collaboration with the planning department, that it come back.
Okay, do we have a second? So we have a second, to table this matter to a future meeting to be determined. Do we have any discussion?
I've got one item of discussion. This that you provided is different from what was provided in the package. Is that, I'm a little confused. I want to make sure I'm.
Correct, I think there was a timing issue in which I emailed that out and then had made some additional.
This one you handed out is one we need to be talking about.
Correct, that's correct. Any further discussion?
Well, I'm fine with tabling this and coming back to it, just in the interest of protecting my own professional responsibility. I think when we're talking about this board interpreting case law, I think I need to be careful that just want to make clear that I'm not an attorney for the town, so I won't be providing any legal guidance if that comes up in our further discussions.
I understand. Any further discussion? With that, all in favor? Motion passes. Moving on to the next item on our agenda. Sorry, my computer died. Moving on to item 5A.
Okay, Happy New Year, everyone. It's great to see y'all. I do not have anything. If you guys have questions about the table, then we will answer those now. We were just asked to put this together about how we were addressing some of the UNC School of Government items.
One quick question. On this section, I think it's on the third table to the right, third box down, amend development regulations to align appeals, subdivision plat decisions with clarified statutory rules. I believe that was associated with Senate Bill 768. And that particular bill was signed into law on July 8th of 2022. But it appears the text amendments that are referenced there were the year prior. So I'm not sure that that particular piece of this has been addressed. I couldn't find anything in the ordinances where that had been taken care of. So if staff could take a look at that just to confirm that that particular piece has been addressed, because if those are the text amendments that are implying, there seems to be a date difference. The law was passed after those text amendments were put in place.
Emily, could you speak to that?
Any further questions?
I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't quite hear all that. It's my ears, it's not you.
Yes, the ordinance is in compliance. As you all recall, we did a major overhaul of the subdivision ordinance, and the subdivision ordinance as written is in compliance with these changes.
Thank you.
Anything else any questions from the board? Hearing none, let's move on to the next agenda item. Item 5B, discussion on subcommittees. So we have talked about a number of things where we may need to form subcommittees on this board previously, either looking at developing a list of ambiguous terms or surveys or that sort of thing. In the past, this board had a traffic impact analysis subcommittee to look at specific issues. We only have limited time during our board meetings to really dig in and almost act as a work session to dive into some of these issues and really flush out details and ask questions. So it seems that forming maybe some permanent subcommittees, one that focuses on ordinance issues, and maybe one that focuses on planning process, could be considered. I'd like to just open that and other ideas up to the board for discussion about forming, permanent and/or temporary subcommittees. Don't all talk at once. Okay, well, if no one has any objections, I would like to make a motion that we form a permanent subcommittee with members to be determined that focuses on ordinance-related issues that can provide additional research and guidance to this board, as well as one that can focus on planning processes. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion to form permanent subcommittees, one focusing on ordinance-related issues and the other on planning-related processes. Any discussion? Ms. Kelly?
I would maybe like to hear from whether the town board thinks there's a need for these, or if we're voting for this today, is it to go ahead and establish them? Or to move forward the discussion to see if it's something the town board is interested in?
We can open it up to that. I mean, we're in the discussion phase, so happy to hear any feedback.
I see no purpose for it.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion?
I have some. I think that just based on the tone of this meeting today, we need to figure out a way to become less adversarial. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'm not so sure that forming subcommittees that don't include staff and town board is heading in that direction. I just mentioned to Frank that this is a huge learning curve for me. I listened to Mr. Gammon. I can promise you I'll never spend as much time as Matt does on these issues. I've worked with Dan a long time. But I think that we don't need to form any type of a group or subcommittee that's not heading back to the direction that it sounds to me like or that I feel like we need to be heading as a board and as a town. That's just what I have.
Thank you for that feedback, Mr. Klutz. All right, so, Ms. Jones.
As far as the subcommittees go, I was looking at it as a way that we could help staff because they're obviously understaffed and, they don't have time to do this little type of, I don't want to say piddly stuff, but to actually go in and dig and look at things like that. I mean, are they going to have staff that are going to be able to do that? No. So, I mean, I just looked at it as a way for us to help them out. And then whatever we found, we could take to them, and it would be up to them to determine whether or not the changes were made or anything was added or taken away. I mean, that's just the way that was the way I interpreted the subcommittees.
We do have a very limited amount of time during our meetings, and it would allow us to really vet out some of these things, like the things we've talked about today with mixed-use buildings. If we would have kicked that over to a subcommittee, they could have spent a considerable amount of time kind of vetting that. And we may not have had to spend so much time over the last 4 meetings kind of discussing that one particular issue. So, anyway, Mr. Whitaker.
I'm undecided about this. I would like to see a little more information about what it is you're proposing. So I can understand these two committees, subcommittees that you already talked about. But I also would like to say that the problem with a subcommittee, saving time for the committee, is that when it comes to the overall committee, you're going to just direct those questions to the subcommittee, the same questions you're directing to the staff now, and we're still going to get into the same discussions because we're still going to have the same questions. So I'm not sure it's going to save a lot of time when we meet as a whole, but it might. I'm not sure how I feel about having them. I'm not in favor of trying to set up the committee to do what the staff's getting paid to do. I don't think that's what we need to be doing. We'll be in their way, and they're going to perceive that we're taking their work away from them. And I'm not sure any of us really have the time to apply to it. So, but I mean, I can see some value in it. I'm just not sure which way I would go right now today on it, just without a little more information.
Okay, well, we've got kind of a mixed bag on, I think, how everybody feels about it. This may be something we just need to, maybe I just need to withdraw the motion and we revisit it at a later date. So I will, I'm gonna withdraw my motion, and we'll just move on to the next agenda item and see if we can look at this at a later date, if it makes sense. If everybody's okay with that. Moving on to item 5C.
The good news is I don't have a meeting at 6 o'clock. We don't have to clear out, but we generally finish at 5. So, Mr. Chairman and board members, I can go through whatever it is you want me to go through right now. I'm happy to do that because I'm ready to do it, but
Mr. Whitaker does need to leave at 5:15. Does anybody else have any issues going past 5 o'clock today?
Honestly, I don't think we'll be in here past 5:15. We need to get this off the docket.
I'd like to go ahead with it, yeah.
Okay.
yeah. So, so the issue that we have is you can have like one apartment building on one lot, or you could have it part of apartment building as part of a major subdivision complex. One of the issues we've identified as a concern is when you have one apartment building on one lot, when that building can get pretty big and it can be next to some slower density, single-family duplexes, townhomes, and we don't have special setbacks based on how big it is. So this text amendment is trying to address that issue. At our last meeting, the chairman correctly said, well, can you describe to us how this text amendment, this one building, one lot, relates to the previous text amendment you made a recommendation on? And that text amendment is kind of the second paragraph, where it was, if you've got a major subdivision, and so if you have an apartment complex in a major subdivision, that language that was recommended by the, in that chart that was recommended by the Ordinances Advisory Board kicks in. And if you're double the density of your neighbor, then you got a 40-foot setback, otherwise it's 20 foot. Okay, so hopefully that kind of addresses how does this new text amendment interrelate with this? It doesn't. That text amendment dealt with major subdivisions. This text amendment deals with one building, one lot. Multifamily, one building on one lot. So having said that, the proposed text amendment is to move the multifamily homes as a use permitted by right and put it as a use permitted by, with conditions in the neighborhood residential, NR, neighborhood center, NC, town center, TC, in the highway commercial, HC. So the text amendment is, and let me just erase all these dots here because it's bothering me. It probably doesn't bother anybody else. So, so the text amendment in those 4 zones where you can see on the left-hand side, uses permitted by right, we're striking out multifamily homes. And then uses permitted with conditions, we're putting multifamily homes in there. And that's now section 9.64. Section 9.64 then says in these districts, you're going to be subject to these standards. And so number 1 sets out different setbacks based on the circumstance that's involved with one building, one lot. It also in part B talks about, okay, when you do that spacing, how much buffer, how much screening do you do? It's not just a setback, it's also screening, trees and shrubs. So that's what B sets up. And then subsection 2 talks about, well, if it's part of a major subdivision, then it's going to be subject to that new law that we just talked about. If it's either 20 foot or it's either 40 foot if it's double the density. So having said that, let me talk about the different gradations, if you will, of setback. So one multifamily home on one lot be subject to the following, with the minimum buffer widths for adjoining, excluding street right-of-ways shall be as follows. So it's 5 feet minimum buffer width of any of the following circumstance. Apartment has 4 dwelling units or less. Boundaries are internal to a major subdivision containing the apartments. Or C, the apartment adjoins property zone, town center, TOD-R, or TOD-E, regardless of the number of units density. So that's a 5-foot setback. Then it goes up to 10 foot in any of the other following circumstances. Density is less than 10 units an acre, regardless of the adjoining use. The apartment is 10 units an acre or more and adjoins anything other than a detached house, duplex, or attached house. And then finally, 3 deals with a 20-foot minimum buffer width when the density is between 10 and 15 units an acre and is adjoining a detached house, duplex, or attached house, and then 30 feet if it's between 15 plus and 20 units an acre, again, adjoining a detached house, a duplex house, or attached house. Or finally, it goes up to 40 feet minimum if the density exceeds 20 units an acre is adjoining one of these detached duplex house or attached house. And then, again, B just deals with the landscaping that you have to put in that setback area. So that's the recommendation. Just to give you a sense of how might this affect some properties that have been approved. So these are all the units, so it's one apartment building on one lot. The first one is Mosaic Senior, that's off of Beatties Ford Road, 130 units on 9.5 acres. And this is the site plan, and they are over 40 feet from the single family they adjoin, so they would that wouldn't have to change. The next one is Norman Lots. They don't adjoin any of the residential zones, so they'd be fine. Next one is Stumptown Apartments. That was 18 units, 1.7 acres. It adds up to 16 units an acre. You see the site plan, even though you don't know what the setbacks are, but you can see it's a little bit closer to property lines. That would be a problem because at 16 units an acre, they would have to be 30 feet from single family. So that plan would not have been able to approve this change. Next one is Belmar. That would not have to be modified because they don't adjoin the uses that we require, the additional setback. Then you got Old Statesville Apartment. That's that one little apartment back here. It's kind of down in a hole. And because that adjoins other town center zone, that'd be okay at 5 feet. And then Caldwell Station Senior Apartments would be, it's 134 units. That is 20 units an acre, but they are 30 feet from the property lines of the adjoining townhomes. And so they're fine as well. Album Senior Living, that's on Prosperity Church Road, they would be fine because they just surround right-of-way, so that's going to be fine. There's the Sam First Senior, it's under construction now, it's 62 units on 2 acres, so it's 30 units an acre. And that would be a problem because it is a 40-foot setback, and they would not meet that. Now, let me put an asterisk next to that. When they went forward to the town board, they went through conditional rezoning because their lot was sitting low, and they wanted to have a taller building than what the 36 feet allowed. So they actually went through conditional rezoning to ask for a modification, and the reason they asked for that is they were down lower than the townhomes they had joined, and the town board approved it. So the reason why I put an asterisk on there, they could have also asked for a reduction of the 40-foot setback, or from a reduction of the 40-foot setback. So just as an FYI, Sam First Senior did go through conditional rezoning so that they could have a little bit taller building than what was allowed, and they could have also asked for that modification, okay? And then the last one is Samford Apartments. That's not been approved yet. It's 244 units on 10 acres at 24 units an acre, and that's the site plan. That would not be able to be approved because there would be a 40-foot setback, and they're probably about 16, 17 feet from the parking lot to that property. So that would not be allowed. So so I tried to just give you a sense of how it might apply. I'm going to go back to the actual ordinance, and happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Gammon?
I have one question, one comment. Jack, and maybe I missed it to make sure I'm clear. What zones are still by right for the multifamily instead of having to be approved with condition?
Right, so that's the town center, the neighborhood center, the neighborhood residential, and highway commercial.
Those 4 zones still are by right?
Right, they're by right. Now, and I will say this, if it is part of a major subdivision, they do have a cap of 30% attached. So in other words, if I'm doing a big subdivision and I want to put apartments in there, if I have 100 units on my subdivision, 30 of them could be in an apartment. So there's that cap. That cap doesn't exist when you have one building and one lot. You don't have that.
And my comment is I fully support what I've read. I don't see anything there that I disagree with. Anything that puts approval back in the public light and with public comment, I'm all for. So this doesn't stop. This is not, I won't use the dirty word moratorium on housing, but this is the town board's going to have to make some decisions, and it brings things back to the town board instead of being surprised when a buy right hits and they didn't know, and then they get 50 citizens in town hall yelling at them for, why did you build this apartment complex there? So I don't have a problem with this.
Any additional comments, questions for staff?
You ready for a motion?
Yeah, we're ready for a motion. If nobody
You
has any-
should have the honor of this motion. This is the last motion for this tenure, because I know you're going to be back for the next 3 years.
Let me make sure I don't mess it up. I'll make a motion to approve TA 22-16 as written.
Do we have a second? We have a second. So the motion on the floor is to approve TA 22-16 as written by staff. Is there any discussion? No discussion? All in favor? Opposed? Motion passes.
I have a closing comment, if I may.
Yes.
I want to tell everyone on this board, I enjoy coming here to these meetings, and I've come here for a long time. I've probably been here longer than 3 years because I'm appointed, I'm a volunteer for this board from the planning department, so I've been able to backseat a lot, and I came up when a planning board member couldn't be here. And like you guys say, your learning curve, my learning curve is still going up, Every time I'm around Jack, I learn something else. He straightens me out. But, go to other meetings. This is a good board. This is a good place to learn and about what's going on. I mean, for the planning board members, I learn a lot here before items come to the planning board. And just because I vote for or against something here does not mean I have to vote for or against it when it comes to the planning board, because things change. But if there's public out there, they need to get on these boards. This is a great opportunity to serve the town, and you learn a lot. It is work. People don't realize, but you get a six-figure salary for this, you know you do. They're all zeros, but you get a six-figure salary. That's all I have, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gammon. Well, that was the last thing on our agenda today. Thank you, everybody, for your time and participation today. I'd like to open the floor up for a motion to adjourn. Do we have
second.
And we have a second. All in favor? Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week.